Hello, everyone, and good evening. Welcome to Sustainability and Consumption. Before we move on to our workshop, please join me in a land acknowledgement. The UC San Diego community holds great respect for the land and the original people of the area where our campus is located. The university was built on the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. Today, the Kumeyaay people continue to maintain their political sovereignty and cultural traditions as vital members of the San Diego community. We are honored to share this space with them and we thank them for their stewardship. This land acknowledgement was adapted from the UCSD Intertribal Resource Center. Now, before we get started, we'll be doing introductions and I'll pass it on to Joss.
Hello, y'all. I'm Joss. I use they, them pronouns. I am a third year developmental psychology major. We didn't put that on there, doesn't really matter, but I'll include it in. And I'm the affiliates and leadership intern, as well as a social justice educator for the Cross.
Going into our outline, we will first be discussing the introduction to our workshop. So, what is sustainable living? Next, we'll be moving on to talking about statistics, and we'll be going over videos and case studies. We'll also be going over Indigenous populations and the examples of sustainable living. And finally, what can we do and how to make a difference and be sustainable consumers. And before we get too into depth with our workshop, I do want to make a quick disclaimer that we are using Zoom closed captioning. And when this recording is uploaded to our YouTube channel, you will be able to view the closed captions through the YouTube setting to view closed captions. Thank you.
All right, so as Tiffany said, first we'll begin with an introduction to what sustainable living is and what that looks like. So go to the next slide. First, we'll go over a quick definition of what sustainable living is and what consuming entails. The definition on the right is from a website called The Good Trade. They defined living sustainably as prioritizing the use of natural and renewable resources instead of creating excess waste and depleting resources for future generations. And then for the next slide, a point that I do want to make early on is that often ideas of sustainable living as it's shown by influencers or even environmentalists don't actually show the actuality of how different environmental policies have unequal impacts on certain communities. So the same social inequalities that have an impact on systems of inequality also target environmentally vulnerable communities within the United States or even vulnerable ecosystems globally, with those in power harming their environments over our own, as well as keeping the resources for sustainable living less accessible for marginalized communities. So the intersectional environmental movement is working to try to dismantle these bigger systems of oppression and make sure that we see that different aspects of identities such as race, gender, class, and ability, just to name a few, they can't be separated from these environmental discussions. Part of this, as I said, is trying to make resources more available to those in environmentally impacted areas. An example of this would be things like food deserts, which we'll talk more about later. Accessibility of these kind of resources is also difficult for disabled people, as sustainable options might not be the most practical for people who have different medical needs. For example, there's a trend of no waste or low waste influencers and doing this thing where they try to keep all of their trash in 1 year in like a little jar, and they'll make a video of them talking about that. But these kind of things might not be as realistic for people who have high amounts of medical waste that they can't control because they need that to keep themselves healthy and independent or even just alive. So it commodifies the idea of living low waste and kind of get into a trend. So first we'll go into a discussion question on the next slide. One that I wanted to pose for y'all is, how do you think that your community is or isn't affected by environmental injustices? Were you taught about sustainable living in your home or in your schools? Y'all can also introduce yourselves if you'd like to, talk a little bit about where you're from, just to get a better idea. I think for this question, I definitely came from the lower income community, and I definitely saw the impact of like food deserts on my community. I'll go more into that later, but I also wasn't taught a lot about sustainable living until I took like a specific environmental science class. So I didn't really get to learn more beyond the reduce, reuse, recycle that they always told us. Yeah, y'all can answer this question in the chat if you feel comfortable. Make sure to set it to all panelists and attendees, and we'll give y'all a few minutes to answer if you'd like.
I see that someone has message in the chat from Joycey, and Joycey says, "My city is surrounded by oil refineries, and I thought it was a normal thing. I was never taught about sustainable living at home or school, and I barely learned about environmental racism last year." Yeah, honestly, I can definitely agree with that in learning about environmental racism because I also did not know that it was a thing before, like until recently. So thank you for your contribution. And Joseph writes, "Not much about it, but don't worry because that is what we are here for." Alora writes, "Hi, my name is Alora. Hi, Alora. You're a fourth year six college student, and while you have definitely learned about sustainability through family, friends, and social media, you don't think you learned much about any form of sustainability in school, even college." Yeah, and I usually see UCSD try to like implement ways to be sustainable, but I can definitely see where you're coming from. And then don't worry because we are also here to promote sustainability here at UCSD through the Cross Cultural Center. Andrew writes, Andrew also didn't so know about environmental racism until he moved to UCSD. Yeah, and that's what I noticed that pattern that we know about sustainability, but not much about environmental racism, in which we will definitely go through that in today's webinar. Frederico writes, "You live in a region near the Salton Sea, so that is a real cause for concern. Aside from that, your region relies heavily on agriculture, so it's not unusual to smell pesticide or manure in the air." Yeah, actually, to comment on that, I had a few friends that live close to like a cow or dairy farm, and the smell of pesticides and manure were definitely in the air. And Alora writes, "You are definitely unfamiliar with intersectional environmental injustices and am excited to learn more about that." Thank you for your excitement and interest. Don't you worry, because as I mentioned like twice earlier, we'll definitely go over that through the webinar. So I'm very excited to present what we have and what we know to you all tonight. By all means, we could move forward in the webinar, and I do still encourage you all to message in the chat and write your thoughts, and we will definitely get to them. Thank you.
All right, so now we'll be talking a little bit about some case studies as well as some data that I can provide on how environmentalism impacts your day-to-day life, especially for vulnerable populations and for people of color. One impact that environmental sustainability and our choice of consumption has on the environment is what food we choose to eat, like I said before, but for some people, they kind of have no choice. So there's a governmental thing called redlining. That's basically them sectioning off typically black and brown communities from wider communities, and that reduces their accessibility to different financial and nutritional resources based on where they live. This also often leads to things called food deserts, which I described before. So they're urban areas in which it's difficult to buy affordable or good quality fresh food. So these folks are a lot less likely to have access to fresh and organic foods because stores that would hold them aren't built in their communities, or if they are, they're too expensive for that social class to afford. So stores like Trader Joe's or Whole Foods, which are very prominent chains in places like La Jolla, aren't as common in lower income areas. And then the only things that those people are able to eat are more processed foods and things that might not be as good for the environment or as nutritionally enriching for them. One example of this was in West Oakland. They haven't had a full service grocery store there in over 40 years. So an entrepreneur named Brahm Amadi, he struggled to gain the resources in order to open them a community food market, just because the loaners tend to be hesitant to give to a cause that won't gain them much margins and won't gain them much profit because he's trying to sell them at an affordable price. He was finally able to open it in June of 2019. This is really important because the lack of nutrition options in these communities often lead to higher cases of disease and of early death compared to communities that have better eating options and less lower income households. On the next slide, we'll have some examples and the impacts of non-sustainable business practices. So one to note that we wanted to talk about was the fashion industry. which I've seen become more of a point of debate in places like TikTok and Twitter. It's estimated that $400 billion of clothes is thrown out every year, despite the fact that it takes thousands of liters of water just to create one cotton t-shirt. So factories that tend to make fast fashion options for websites like Shein also tend to use either cheap or child labor or a combination of the two. And they tend to barely pay their workers enough to live comfortably, not even to mention the poor working conditions that they do have to face while they're inside these factories. We can also see climate change impacting our day-to-day life and our day-to-day health with things like weather patterns and weather conditions and higher mortality rates and increased poverty. So with the winter storms that were happening in Texas recently, that stuff hasn't happened in a long time. And climate change can be one of the things that lead to that contribution. We also wanted to talk a bit about accessible, sustainable transportation, as that's kind of an important environmental impact that affects our day-to-day lives quite a bit. So there are three main things that help prevent sustainable transportation or accessibility to it. And these things are energy input, emissions, and social impact. If we can go to the next slide, it'll show a little bit more about it. So in terms of energy input, we mostly use oils as our main energy source if you think driving your car, but we have to acknowledge that these resources aren't renewable, meaning that once we use it, we can't get it back. And we only have a limited amount of it that the earth can provide us. So we can't sustainably rely on gas-powered vehicles as much as we do right now. But electric cars or even solar-powered cars, once they become more of a thing, they do tend to be more expensive and they're less accessible to the average person as a day-to-day option. Next, we have the impact of emissions on the environment. So this is a big issue with public health. Gas-powered cars have all kinds of noxious emissions, not only for the environment, but for people. Sulfur dioxides, carbon monoxide, and different particulate matter that come out of cars are both irritants for humans, like our lungs and our respiratory system, but it's also harmful for the different plants in the environment that are around places like highways. Carbon dioxide is also a big emission that is one of the biggest greenhouse gases that harms the ozone layer, which is a layer above the sun that helps protect us from this, or above the earth that helps protect us from the sun. There's also a big social impact when it comes to using automobiles and non-sustainable forms of transportation. As I said, cars tend to be the most accessible financially, or even things like busing and trains. And alternatives like walking or biking might not be the most accessible for not able-bodied people, or for people who are more likely to be harmed if they're not being protected by their own private vehicle. So you can see the benefits of things like sustainable transportation options, but you also need to recognize that as they exist right now, it's not accessible for everybody. On the next slide, we can show a little bit on how sustainability can be accessible to most folks. So a perfect example of this that we wanted to give were things like donation centers and thrift stores. So these businesses help to supply lightly used goods at a fair price, which combats things ending up in landfills and provides a space for old items to find new homes. So you see this more common in lower income communities where you can get cheaper clothes, stuff that might last you a little bit longer, and you're also helping your community by donating to these places and giving them money. So these are a few low cost options on how you can live more sustainably on a budget. So the first one is compost. So this is a really cost-effective way to try to be more eco-friendly at home. It helps improve soil quality and the plant growth by reusing decomposed materials, and it helps with erosion control and can even degrade and bind certain pollutants, so it keeps them from going into the air. So to do this, you would take your leftover grass clippings or even produce into a container, and then you keep it damp and you regularly turn the pile in order to keep the biological processes underway. So you want to try it during the warmer months, but in San Diego, it's kind of always warm. So you could look up more into that and how to do composting. There's also some places that'll give you composting materials either for free or for a lower cost. Another thing you can focus on is your water usage. So heating water requires a lot of energy. So it might be better to do your laundry with cold to warm water, taking quicker and colder showers, also trying to reuse your water as much as possible. So either collecting rainwater, or if you're waiting for your shower to warm up, you can collect the cold water and use that for your plants. One that's not talked about a lot that I've seen a lot of people talking about more is the use of native plants if you're doing things like gardens. So when you're landscaping, you can choose plants that require less water, they require less fertilizers and a lot less pesticides, just because they're specifically designed for our environment and for our climate. So you can ask people at like Home Depot or whatever which ones might be the best to, so you can invest in your house and your property without it needing a lot to thrive. Things like grass yards take a lot of water and take a lot of stuff to keep it healthy just because it's not meant for our environment. And it helps decrease your carbon footprint without spending too much money or more money than you would with other options. We can go into our next section. So this next section will talk a little bit about Indigenous populations and how they tend to live more sustainably and protect the environment. So the title at the top I take from a Sustainability's Time article, where they point out that Indigenous people hold the key to protecting the environment. They say it a little bit more dramatically than it needs to be said, but I did want to point out the fact that people who were native to the land that we occupy were able to sustainably live off of what the land gave them and were able to provide for themselves without harming the earth. But the role of Indigenous people hasn't really been acknowledged in environmental spaces until very recently. It was only in 1992 that a UN summit finally established protections for the knowledge and the practices of Indigenous folks when it comes to managing the environment and conserving its natural resources and its beauty. So if we look at the land that Indigenous folks occupy, it tends to be much more biodiverse than occupied lands, meaning that there are less plant and animal species that are going extinct as the result of people living there. So we've been taking over and occupying Indigenous lands and only harming the wildlife on it that they worked for generations to protect. So as it says on the slide, Indigenous folks make up only 5% of the world's population now, but they protect 80% of the global biodiversity within their small communities that colonizers allowed them to have. So then a question we can ask, which y'all can keep in mind or say your thoughts about in the chat, is if being mindful of our environmental impact and what our footprint is would be our duty as folks who occupy Indigenous lands, and if being more respectful and more responsible in that aspect can help ensure that we're good allies for Native people. So the next slide, just wanted to talk a little bit more about how Indigenous folks live sustainably, and how we can take example from them to figure out what to do to advance our own sustainability efforts. Let me check the comment in the chat really quick. I've also heard of people doing yard gardens instead of having grass as another option on the side of native plants. That does require time and effort as opposed to just planting native plants. Yeah, I've also seen people do moss yards. So moss kind of looks the same, but it takes a lot less water and it grows differently. I don't know too much about it, but that, or even just having concrete or rock, people are starting to get more creative. So back to the slides. Indigenous people do hold a lot of generational knowledge. So it's things that are passed on from thousands of years that help them know how to interact with the delicate balance between plants and animals and other microorganisms in order to make sure that we're maintaining the ecology as we coexist with all of these other living things. Through these traditions and knowledges that have been passed on, Indigenous folks ensure that they're able to fully enjoy these resources that the earth provides without having to worry about the well-being of the future generations or of other species, in a good way, not the way that like people tend to be ignorant about that kind of stuff, but they know they don't have to worry because they've worked so hard to maintain that balance between us and the environment. So they know that the way that they live has carried the earth to a good place so far, and that it'll continue to work to protect their people and the earth. So the quote I have on the little third section is from an article from UNESCO, or I think it's the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. I hope I got that right. But they're not just now beginning to acknowledge that Indigenous communities can hold a higher role in these climate change spaces, and that they're an important source of knowledge for climate change assessment and adaptation. So we can clearly see a lot of benefits in including Indigenous folks, especially Indigenous women and people who have a lot of knowledge of past Indigenous populations, in these spaces that make big decisions around environment and climate change on a global scale. But then we can question how we would ensure that we're not exploiting Indigenous labor and Indigenous culture and knowledge after centuries of us just hurting their lands. So we would ask, in what ways could we provide for them and provide them compensation both for their knowledge and for the harm that we've caused, that we need their knowledge to fix, and how we can respectfully pull from their knowledge while also knowing that we're using their culture and what they've learned for the greater good.
Thank you, Joss, for a really good informational session on consuming sustainably. So, moving on to our fourth section of our webinar, social action. Here we'll be going over what we can do to make a difference locally and globally. But first, we have a discussion question. And so, our second discussion question of the night is, what do you do today to contribute to conscious consumerism? And remember to set your chat functions to all panelists and attendees. While we are waiting, I can comment to this question. One thing that I do is to not try to contribute to fast fashion as regularly as I did. When I was younger, I would go to the sales section in Urban Outfitters or like H&M and like be super excited that I'm getting all these deals on clothes. But little did I know their production habits aren't as sustainable as I thought they were. And so I have directed my energy towards buying secondhand or upcycling.
Yeah, I think one point that I try to make just to contribute to this is trying to be as plant-based as possible. Sometimes it's not as accessible as I'd like it to be, or I don't have the knowledge on how to make sure that I'm getting all of my nutrients while also being plant-based. So I try to be plant-based as much as possible, but sometimes it's an accessibility issue. But that can help a lot with your environmental footprint.
Yeah, Joss, I think it's really cool how you are trying to be more plant-based because, well, I'll be going over this a little later in the presentation, but maybe implementing something like Meatless Mondays or, just trying to get the flow going for the rest of the week. Okay, we now have responses flowing in. Gina says, you use less plastic and reusing the plastic that I do use, such as utensils, paper wrapping, water bottles, etc. Yes, I will also agree to this. I also do this. I am from an Asian household and we save our plastic bags and we reuse them. So, yes, I also do the same. Whoa. Okay. Denise says you try to use electronic devices such as cell phone, computer until they no longer work instead of buying its new version every year. I support that because you don't need to buy the most recent iPhone or computer. If you want to, go ahead. I'm not telling you what to do, but I also contribute to this practice in keeping my old phone until I really need to get a new one. Andrew writes, stop buying clothes from fast fashion stores, stop buying water bottles and use hydro flasks instead, going paper free whenever you can. Yes, yes, and yes. Thank you, Andrew, for your contribution. I also have limited my buying habits from fast fashion stores. I also don't use plastic water bottles as often, and going paper free, I give you a lot of props because that is a really good goal to have or a really good habit to have. The next person writes, you try to buy ethically sourced products and you're shifting your family away from single-use plastics. I think that is great. So keep on doing that and thank you for your answer. Alora writes, trying to follow some good advice you got. The most sustainable option is the things you already have. Yes. To continue, you write, sometimes replacing things with reusable/sustainable things is more harmful than trying to get a good life out of the things you already have. Yeah, and I really like this because it also hones in on the habit of upcycling and reusing what you have and not buying like the latest trends, and you can use what you have to maybe form your own style. And Anise writes, you try to look for more eco-friendly swaps as a shop, whether it be bathroom items, kitchen items, etc. Additionally, you're shopping, and while you're shopping, you ask yourself if you can use the product for a prolonged time, and if not, I rethink purchasing it. Yeah, and I think that's a really good thing to do because with fast fashion, you could probably get maximum like 5, 4, 3 wears out of a single item. But if you buy something that you will use for a long time, that'll definitely help you in reducing your purchasing. Sara writes, one thing that you've been thinking of doing is shopping for produce that is in season here in San Diego, limiting your participation in fast fashion, or making sure your clothes are put in use for years. Of course, like this is great because you are all honing in on what we were going to be going over tonight, and I'm so happy that we're getting all these like responses. Yes, Joss, you're acknowledging that plant-based foods don't tend to be culturally relevant to a lot of people of color. And as we went over the food deserts, because healthy produce isn't really accessible to communities of color. And Frederico writes, you use shoes until toes shown, but also I just feel comfortable when they're broken in. Yeah, honestly, a good pair of Vans. I've been wearing the same Vans for a really long time. So yeah, I definitely feel that. And finally, Hamlet writes, turning in unused items to Goodwill and thrift shops can be good for your community. Yeah, and I can definitely support that, and you're also contributing to people who are buying secondhand and the like. And so we do have a few more responses, but I do want to go through the presentation, but also I do not discourage you all to keep contributing and commenting to what we have to say. But yeah, we'll be moving on, and so thank you for your contribution. This is great. But I'll also be going over things that we can do, also expressed in the chat earlier, for to locally act to be sustainable consumers. And so I have this quote from the top. Well, not really quote, but saying, because as individuals, we can only do so much. We can not contribute to fast fashion, we can try to buy produce in season, and we can try to upcycle. But further on the presentation, we'll be going over what we can do to make an impact in a wider range. But first, as mentioned earlier, we can be aware of our buying/purchasing habits. So I know that Amazon Prime, sometimes we want our items to come as soon as possible, but sometimes buying Prime or choosing Prime is not the best way to go when you're trying to be environmentally sustainable, because that fast shipping does come at an environmental cost, as well as not contributing to fast fashion. And we should definitely be doing our research on sustainable, ethical, and BIPOC brands. And BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color brands, because they're mainly small businesses, and we can support small businesses versus industrialized corporations for the brands that we like. The second is eating sustainably, as Joss touched on earlier. They try to limit their meat intake and try to be as plant-based as possible. And another suggestion that I might have is doing meatless Mondays or fish Fridays. And third is conserving our energy, such as electricity, water. As also mentioned earlier, water and electricity can be very we cannot be, sometimes we aren't aware of how much we use. And so collecting rainwater or using that cold water for your plants and saving that cold water for the future while waiting for a warm shower can be really beneficial. I also noticed that UCSD has used less water signs in their bathrooms, so I guess that goes to show that UCSD is also trying to take sustainable steps towards environmental benefits. The fourth one is reusing/recycling. Recycling or reusing, we can bring this topic back to fast fashion and not contributing to it. And upcycling or reusing clothes, or donating clothes to Goodwill or Savers or your local thrift store. The fifth is participating in community gardens. I know that Warren has a community garden, and they teach you skills on how to grow your own food. But if you don't want to grow your own food, or if it's not feasible/doable in your situation, you can do research on the brands you buy your produce from and make sure they are treating their farmers ethically, as well as buy produce that is in season, as Sara said earlier. Now, we will be touching on accountability for big corporations. Now, it's not easy to just ask businesses to change what they're doing overnight, because they've stayed in their practice that started a long time ago, which helps keep them successful. However, what we can do is look at a few ways we can hold them accountable, because we are mainly their main consumers/customers. So from the source, greenpeace.org, their article titled, "How do we make corporations more accountable?" I found really interesting how they came up with some steps and principles for corporate accountability, in which I'll be presenting 4 of them this evening with you all. The first is getting involved in policy making. And so getting involved in policy making could be seen as the businesses holding conferences, or in general consider being open to making changes in their production processes. The second is transparency to the people. I shorten this to mean that states can create policies that provide transparency in practicing amongst corporate and government activities that impact environmental and human rights. So some examples from the source include trade, finance, and tax transparency from the corporation or the business to the people. The third is production practices that harm human and environmental rights should be abandoned. And so on the topic of rethinking policy, corporates should acknowledge that if their production processes are harmful to human rights and the environment, then they should lose those habits and abandon them and renew them to cater towards a more healthy and sustainable practice. And finally, the focus of rethinking policy should be catered towards the environmental and people of the community. So, as said earlier, rethinking policy for corporation and big businesses should be geared towards serving and promoting healthy practices for the environment and people of the community. In addition to abandoning unhealthy and unsustainable practices, rethinking and redefining the policy should be renewed and created to promote sustainability amongst the community and the environment. And so, why is accountability important? The information I'll be presenting to you is from the article, How Can We Hold Big Businesses Accountable to Started Social Impact Goals by Alexa on novelhand.com. And so the first reason why accountability is important is because it tackles the issue of vagueness. Companies can withhold information about their production habits. As individuals who care about sustainable business practices, we can ask the business how they are maintaining and implementing environmental and human-friendly production policy. It is one thing for a corporation to say that they would like to cut down greenhouse gas emissions on their production habits, but it's another to be transparent and provide the public actual information on how they're going to be doing that or will be doing that. The second is accountability promotes collective action. I found this example through the source I mentioned earlier, and collective action amongst consumers, for example, an example for this could be the ethical fashion brands Able and Nizzolo. The brand started a campaign called the Lowest Wage Challenge, and the product of this challenge brought light to how about only 2% of brands in fashion paid their employees a livable wage. The challenge inspired consumers to ask companies and businesses what their lowest wage amount is, which leads to the rise of accountability and transparency between consumer and corporation. Finally, accountability is important because it can lead to legislative changes which tackle the issues of discrimination and tolerance and the issue of paying employees a fair wages and the like. Now, we have covered local action to help hold businesses accountable to their sustainable mission, but what can the government do? Well, also taken from the source mentioned earlier, the government can get involved by implementing legislative challenges that tackles the issue of discrimination, unfair wages, and the like amongst big corporations who essentially aid in the fuel of capitalism. And next, we will be going over a video titled Understanding How to Implement Sustainable Business Models by Boston Consulting Group. In the video, Wendy Woods and David Young, who are Boston Consulting Group senior partners, talk about how product innovation and sustainable business models can drive businesses towards their appeal to not only consumers, but also their partnerships.
To win the 20s, companies need to think differently, broadly about the way we're delivering capitalism in the world today. We need business models that are much more aligned with the broader set of both customer needs, employee needs, and our environmental needs at this point.
The common characteristic will be that good companies and good investments deliver both competitive financial returns and also help society meet some of its most challenging problems. And this will require us to adopt new mindsets. It will require that we reimagine corporate strategy.
The risks of climate, the risks of the inequality that we have in the world today are creating pressures on businesses. From employees who are looking for much, much more purpose-filled companies. They're creating risks and concerns from investors who understand the direness and the urgency of the climate agenda. And they're creating risks from a customer perspective who are demanding more and have the transparency to understand what they didn't understand before about the products and the companies that they're actually choosing and not choosing today in the world. Product innovation, service innovation is key to meeting the wants, the needs, the aspiration of the world as embodied in the UN Sustainable Development Goals.
The Sustainable Development Goals represent a shared universal set of aspirations. Therefore, we believe it's an incredibly useful tool for every company to take a look at their business, their capabilities, their customers, and their suppliers through the lens of the SDGs. The SDGs are human needs. Therefore, they're market opportunities. And the most clever companies, those with some courage, some foresight, that begin to see their business not just in the walls of their company, but as the ecosystem in which they're part of, this gives them a way of going after those problems.
In global health, we've brought down the number of children dying of malaria. We brought down the incidence of HIV. We know that with that innovative perspective in both products and how we partner together between public, private, and social sector to deliver those product innovations, we can make progress.
Perhaps the most interesting area is this focus on innovation for sustainable business models. This starts with owning the origins of things that have deep societal content: clean energy, preserved biodiversity, owning the full cycle, the whole life cycle of products, so that we look at circular economy, that we think about designing for reusability. And then if we go sort of move beyond that, how do we think about relocalizing or regionalizing supply chains today that are stretched all around the world so that we bring the societal benefits closer to home? We would argue that if you're capable as a company in doing this, it'll help you drive innovation. It'll help you think creatively about areas you've never seen before.
I thought that video was interesting because it's important to note that change won't happen overnight and it won't be as easy, but through collective action and demand, we could create change by building partnerships and making an influence on the importance of sustainable production. And before we dive into how to be a conscious consumer, I do want to mention the comments that were made earlier from Joss. You say your Vans have a little hole in it, but it adds character. I definitely agree. I think it's very cute. So yes. And Joycey writes, some of the clothes that you wear, you've been using since middle school. Me too. Honestly, me too. So we're in the same boat with that. And Joss also knows that Marshall and ERC have a community garden too. So if you are in UCSD and you want to contribute to their community garden, you can volunteer at Marshall, ERC, Warren, and maybe other colleges that hold community gardens, but that's one way you can contribute to how to be a conscious consumer. Moving on to our last slide on some more tips on how to be a conscious consumer is to be mindful of who you buy from. So that also takes us back to the information that we talked about, which is to be mindful of the companies that you purchase from. We're not asking you to definitely stop your purchases and to not buy from them anymore, but we are trying to bring into light the importance of possibly limiting your fast fashion purchases. Next is to understand that you don't need to spend money to indulge in self-care. So sometimes I could be guilty of this. Sometimes I'll be like, hard day, I'll go buy a candle, but sometimes I don't need to buy that candle, or sometimes you don't need to buy a new pair of shoes to practice the act of self-care. Self-care could look different for everyone, and it doesn't have to be retail therapy, although sometimes it can work, but for the most part, let's try to limit our retail therapy for now. And the third way to be a conscious consumer is to reuse and upcycle. I love the topic of reusing and upcycling because I believe that you can use products more than once, more than twice. I try to use it to its entirety and I don't like to waste. So that is why I included that in there. And the fourth is to be mindful of marketing deceptions. We all know this, I hope we all know this, or if not, then I will be disclosing to you that sometimes we fall to want to buy something because of how it's advertised to us, and you got to take a step back. And sometimes I even have to take a step back and ask myself, I have to do my research and ask if the company is ethical, if they're paying their employees livable wages, if they're using sustainable practices and production habits and the like. And finally, to shop local, whether it be buying fruits in season in your local community, or also participating in or also buying from sustainable fashion brands and small businesses. If there are any other ways that you all practice conscious consumerism, please feel free to add them in the chat, and we are more than happy to read them aloud and also respond to them. But so far, that concludes our presentation tonight, and we have a few announcements for upcoming cross-cultural center programs here at UCSD. First, we have our transfer student mixer, which will be happening week 8, Wednesday, May 19th. And then we have hot topic discussions, which isn't a workshop/presentation, it's more discussion based, where we all gather and talk about the topic. And for that week, it is COVID in communities of color. And we also have a student initiated project by one of our interns, and it's titled The Importance of Art Education. So thank you again for attending the webinar tonight, and feel free to any questions, comments, questions, or concerns in the chat, and we will be more than happy to address them. But if not, that is all that we have prepared for tonight, and we thank you so much for your participation and attendance. Thank you.
Yes, thanks y'all for coming, for listening to us.